Spain has the 14th largest economy by nominal GDP in the world, and 16th largest by purchasing power parity. The Spanish economy is the 5th largest in the European Union, and the 4th largest in the Eurozone, based on nominal GDP statistics. In 2012, Spain was the 12th largest exporter in the world and the 16th largest importer. Spain is listed 23rd in UN Human Development Index and 30th in GDP per capita by World Bank. Thus, it is classified as high-income economy and among the countries of very high human development. However, since the financial crisis of 2007-08, the Spanish economy's recent macroeconomic performance has been poor. Between 2008 and 2012, the economic boom of the 2000s was reversed, leaving over a quarter of Spain's workforce unemployed by 2012. In 2012, the Spanish economy contracted by 1.4% and was in recession until Q3 of 2013. Despite the poor recent performance of the Spanish economy generally, Spain's international trade situation has improved. During the boom years, Spain had built up a trade deficit, eventually reaching a record amounting to 10% of GDP. During the economic downturn, Spain has been significantly reducing imports, increasing exports and kept attracting growing numbers of tourists. As a result, in 2013 it achieved a trade surplus for the first time in 3 decades. In the Global Forecast report dated October 2014, the IMF improved the 2015 GDP growth forecast for Spain, putting it ahead of the Eurozone major economies. Spain is a member of the European Union, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Trade Organization. History. When Spain joined the EEC in 1986, its GDP per capita was about 72% of the average of its members. After a strong recovery from the global recession of the early 1990s, the centre-right government of former Prime Minister José María Aznar had worked successfully to gain admission to the group of countries launching the euro in 1999. Due to its own economic development and the EU enlargements up to 28 members, by 2007 Spain had achieved a GDP per capita of 105% of EU's average, which placed it slightly ahead of Italy. 3 regions were included in the leading EU group, exceeding 125% of the GDP per capita average level. Basque Country leading with Madrid and Navarre. According to calculations by the German newspaper Die Welt, Spain's economy had been on course to overtake countries like Germany in per capita income by 2011. Unemployment stood at 7.6% in October 2006, a rate that compared favorably to many other European countries, and especially with the early 1990s when it stood at over 20%. Perennial weak points of Spain's economy include high inflation, a large underground economy, and an education system. Beside UK and the United States, which OECD reports place among the poorest for developed countries. In particular, growth during the period 1997 to 2007 was led by a property boom fed by historically low interest rates, massive rates of foreign investment, and an immense surge in immigration. At its peak in 2007, construction had expanded to a massive 16% of the total gross domestic products of the country and 12% of total employment. During that time, Spain built up a massive trade deficit, financed by capital inflows including short-term speculative investment was directed mostly to consumption and property rather than at long-term fixed assets such as manufacturing plants and the like. The downside of the real estate boom was a corresponding rise in the levels of personal debt, as prospective homeowners had struggled to meet asking prices. The average level of household debt tripled in less than a decade. This placed especially great pressure upon lower to middle income groups. By 2005, the median ratio of indebtedness to income had grown to 125%. due primarily to expensive boom-time mortgages that now often exceed the value of the property. Noticeable progress continued until early 2008, when the global financial crisis burst Spain's property bubble. A European Commission forecast had predicted Spain would enter a recession by the end of 2008. According to Spain's economy minister, Spain faces its steepest recession in half a century. Spain's government forecast the unemployment rate would rise to 16% in 2009. The ESADE Business School predicted 20%. By 2013, Spain's GDP per capita had fallen back to 95% of EU's average. Reduction of European Union funds capital contributions from the EU, which had contributed significantly to the economic empowerment of Spain since joining the EEC, decreased considerably in recent years due to the economic standardization in relation to other countries and the effects of the EU's enlargement. On the one hand, agricultural funds from the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union are now spread across more countries. On the other hand, the structural and cohesion funds have declined due to the Spanish economic success and due to the incorporation of less developed countries, lowering the average income per capita, so that Spanish regions which were considered to be relatively less developed, are now in the European average or even above it. Spain has gradually become a net contributor of funds for less developed countries of the Union as opposed to receiving funds. Economic and financial crisis. Spain continued on the path of economic growth when the ruling party changed in 2004, maintaining robust GDP growth during the first term of Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. Even though some fundamental problems in the Spanish economy were now becoming clearly evident. Among these, according to the Financial Times, was Spain's rapidly growing trade deficit, which had reached a staggering 10% of the country's GDP by the summer of 2008, the loss of competitiveness against its main trading partners, and, also, as a part of the latter, an inflation rate which had been traditionally higher than the one of its European partners. Back then especially affected by house price increases of 150% from 1998 and a growing family indebtedness chiefly related to the Spanish real estate boom and rocketing oil prices. In 2011 the deficit reached 8.5%. In 2012, that percentage is expected to lower to 5.3% due to a set of tough reforms in the autonomous regions and the central government. Despite the difficulties, it is expected that the deficit will reach 3.3% in 2013. The Spanish government official GDP growth forecast for 2008 in April was 2.3%. This figure was successively revised down by the Spanish Ministry of Economy to 1.6%. This figure looked better than those of most other developed countries. In reality, this rate effectively represented stagnant GDP per capita due to Spain's high population growth because of a high rate of immigration. Retrospective studies by most independent forecasters estimate that the rate had actually dropped to 0.8% instead, far below the strong 3% plus GDP annual growth rates during the 1997 to 2007 decade. Then, during the third quarter of 2008 the national GDP contracted for the first time in 15 years and, in February 2009, it was confirmed that Spain, along other European economies, had officially entered recession. In July 2009, the IMF worsened the estimates for Spain's 2009 contraction to -4% of GDP for the year. Besides, it estimated a further 0.8% contraction of the Spanish economy for 2010. The estimation of the IMF was proven to be somewhat too pessimistic, as Spain's GDP sank less than that of most advanced economies in 2009 and by the first quarter of 2010 had already emerged from the recession. In 2008, the total Spanish public debt relative to the total GDP was well below the European Union average. and in fact the government budget was in surplus. In 2012, public debt increased to 90.69% of GDP, although this remains lower than other European countries such as Italy. Spain's financial problems stem from private debt equivalent to well over 98% of GDP. Property boom and bust. The adoption of the euro saw a marked reduction in interest rates to historic lows. The growth in the Spanish property market, which had begun in 1997, accelerated and within a few years had developed into a property bubble, financed largely by the cajas and fed by the historically low interest rates and a massive growth of immigration. The Spanish economy was credited for having avoided the virtual zero growth rate of some of its largest partners in the EU. Spain's economy created more than half of all the new jobs in the European Union over the 5 years ending 2005. The bubble imploded in 2008, causing the collapse of Spain's large property-related and construction sectors, causing mass layoffs, and a collapsing domestic demand for goods and services. By the end of May 2009, unemployment reached 18.7%. At first, Spain's banks and financial services avoided the early crisis of their counterparts in the US and UK. This was particularly the case with Spain's international banks, Banco Santander and BBVA, that had diversified international portfolios and had actively limited their exposure to housing mortgage risk. Banco Santander was able to profit from the global financial crisis by taking over distressed British banking firms. However, as the recession deepened and property prices slid, the growing bad debts of the smaller regional savings banks, the cajas, forced the intervention of Spain's central bank and government through a stabilization and consolidation program, taking over or consolidating regional cajas and finally receiving a bank bailout from the European Central Bank in 2012. Banking system. Spanish private commercial banks played a central role in Spain's economic development, benefiting from their role as the state's creditor in the 19th century, from their ability to monetize public debt, and from state-sanctioned oligopolistic arrangements that lasted from the beginning of the 20th century until the late 1980s, when European rules forced a liberalization of the sector. It has been argued that the favorable treatment received by the main Spanish commercial banks and the close relationship to the Bank of Spain, following the end of the Franco regime, allowed for a public-private partnership to restructure the large commercial banks into two superbanks with the purpose of preparing the private institutions for international competition and external expansion once the European banking market was integrated in 1992. Alongside this financial mercantilism benefiting the commercial banking sector, Spanish regulators also allowed for the vast expansion of not-for-profit savings banks sponsored by regional governments who became heavily exposed to the housing, mortgage and real estate development sectors during the Spanish economic boom of 1999 to 2007. Prior to 2010, the Spanish banking system was credited as one of the most solid of all Western banking systems in coping with the ongoing worldwide liquidity crisis. Thanks to the country's conservative banking rules and practices, banks were required to have high capital provisions and to demand various guarantees and securities from intending borrowers. This allowed the banks, particularly the geographically and industrially diversified large banks like BBVA and Santander, to weather the real estate deflation better than expected. Indeed, Spain's large commercial banks have been able to capitalize on their strong position to buy up distressed banking assets elsewhere in Europe and in the United States. Nevertheless, with the unprecedented crisis of the country's housing crisis, smaller local savings banks, even though representing a small portion of banking system, are known to have delayed the registering of bad loans, especially those backed by houses and land, to avoid declaring losses. This has occurred despite the fact that these credits are backed by the borrower's present and future assets. CCM, is still the only local savings bank to have suffered a run by depositors. The central bank Banco de España forcibly took over CCM to prevent its financial collapse. The international accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, estimated an imbalance between CCM's assets and debts of €3,500 million, not counting the industrial corporation. There were errors leading to the present situation. On the 22nd of May 2010, the Banco de España took over another Caja as part of a national program to put the country's smaller banks on a firm financial basis. In early June 2012, Spain requested European funding of €100 billion to recapitalize Spanish banks that need it. It is not a rescue, because a real rescue would reach 10 or 12 times that amount. In return for aid, there will be no tax or macroeconomic conditions. The interest from the loan would pay the banks themselves. This plan will be overseen by the IMF, which would not place any money. According to the statement of European Ministers of Finance, the Eurogroup will closely monitor the correction of economic imbalances. The news of funding led to a rise in risk premiums Spanish to very high levels and a strong fall of the stock exchange in Madrid in June and July 2012. It was definitely an overreaction of the markets, according to what rightly stated by the Spanish economy minister. It almost certainly will come some very strong reactions from the markets. Nevertheless, in the medium term, despite all these financial reactions must moderate and the economic performance of Spain and Europe should return to normal and growth. The euro debt crisis. In the first weeks of 2010, renewed anxiety about the excessive levels of debt in some EU countries and, more generally, about the health of the euro has spread from Ireland and Greece to Portugal, and to a lesser extent in Spain and Italy. Many economists recommended a battery of policies to control the surging public debt caused by the recessionary collapse of tax revenues, combining drastic austerity measures with higher taxes. Some senior German policymakers went as far as to say that emergency bailouts should include harsh penalties to EU aid recipients such as Greece. It has been noted that the Spanish government budget was in surplus in the years immediately before the GFC and that its debt was not considered excessive. At the beginning of 2010, Spain's public debt as a percentage of GDP was still less than those of Britain, France or Germany. However, commentators pointed out that Spain's recovery was fragile, that the public debt was growing quickly, that troubled regional banks may need large bailouts, growth prospects were poor and therefore limiting revenue, and that the central government has limited control over the spending of the regional governments. Under the structure of shared governmental responsibilities that has evolved since 1975, much responsibility for spending had been given back to the regions. The central government found itself in the difficult position of trying to gain support for unpopular spending cuts from the recalcitrant regional governments. On the 23rd of May 2010, the government announced further austerity measures, consolidating the ambitious plans announced in January. As of September 2011, Spanish banks hold a record high of €142 billion of Spanish national bonds. December 2011 bond auctions are very likely to be covered, according to JP Morgan Chase. Till Q2 2012, Spanish banks were allowed to report real estate-related assets in higher non-market price by regulators. Investors who bought into such banks must be aware, Spanish houses cannot be sold at land book value after being vacant over a period of years. Employment crisis. Employment is a long-term weakness of the Spanish economy. The structural unemployment rate is currently 18%. After having completed large improvements over the second half of the 1990s and during the 2000s, which put a few regions on the brink of full employment, Spain suffered a severe setback from October 2008, when it saw its unemployment rate surge to 1996 levels. During the period October 2007–October 2008, Spain's unemployment rate climbed 37%, exceeding the unemployment surge of past economic crises, including that of 1993. In particular, during the month of October 2008, Spain suffered its worst unemployment rise ever recorded. By July 2009, it had shed 1.2 million jobs in 1 year. Spain's unemployment rate hit 17.4% at the end of March, with 2 million people losing their jobs, with the oversized building and housing-related industries contributing greatly to the rising unemployment numbers. In this same month, Spain had over 4 million people unemployed. Since 2009, thousands of established immigrants began to leave, although some did maintain residency in Spain due to poor conditions in their country of origin. In May 2012, a radical labor reform began that made for a more flexible labor market and facilitated layoffs. According to the Minister for Employment and Social Security, Fatima Banez, reforms and adjustments made by the Spanish government are beginning to create a situation of economic growth, creating jobs, while rationalization and austerity measures in public spending will show growth employment in the coming months. By the second quarter of 2014, the Spanish economy had reversed its negative trend and started creating jobs for the first time since 2008. The second quarter reversal was sudden and extraordinary considering that the number of jobs created set an absolute positive record since such quarterly employment statistics are maintained. Labor reform seems to have played an important role. One piece of evidence is that Spain is creating jobs at lower rates of GDP growth than before. In previous cycles, employment rose when growth hit 2%. This time the gain came during a year when GDP expanded by just 1.2%. Prices. Due to the lack of own resources, Spain has to import all of its fossil fuels. In a scenario of record prices, this means adding much pressure to the inflation rate. In June 2008, the inflation rate reached a 13-year high at 5.00%. Then, with the dramatic decrease of oil prices that took place in the second half of 2008 plus the manifest bursting of the real estate bubble, concerns quickly shifted over to the risk of deflation, as Spain recorded in January 2009 its lowest inflation rate in 40 years. Followed shortly afterwards, in March 2009, by a negative inflation rate for the first time since the gathering of these statistics started.